In the second part of the lecture, we'll talk about data collection and its challenges, the nitty-gritty details. Conversation analysis is an approach to the study of human interaction that involves reliance on the audio and video recordings of the said interactions so that we can transcribe them in the finest detail, capturing even the most minute features, including measuring pauses and gaps to 1/10 of a second and overlaps to a sound, recording differences in the tone and articulation, pitch changes, wording, and even the number of syllable repetitions if one is trying to get into a conversation or hold their talking spot while others are trying to break in. It is important to remember that transcripts themselves are not data. The interaction is data. But fine-tuned transcripts of the data allow us to observe each interaction we're studying again and again and again, noticing something different every time, something that the participants themselves make relevant to the interaction, something that in the fleeting nature of speech could have easily evaded our keen research eye. And because we need to record interactions, we have to be extremely mindful of the protection of our human participants' rights, privacy, and confidentiality. All human beings deserve utmost respect and privacy. It is unethical and illegal to record them without their explicit consent. Any human being has the right to refuse to be a subject of research, and any human being has the right to know what kind of research they are participating in if they agree to participate. Any human being has the right to withdraw their consent at any time. We will discuss the ethical and legal concerns involved in the process of requesting and obtaining informed consent from the participants a little later in the course. In the meantime, please keep in mind that informed consent is the ethical pillar of any research that involves human beings. In conversation analysis, we're interested in naturally occurring data, actual real-world interactions in which participants make relevant whatever it is that it is relevant for them at that moment in that interaction. This does not mean, however, that all we study is informal conversation. Medical, legal, educational, and workplace discourse have all been subjects of CA studies. Scholars have also investigated scripted dramatic interactions in TV shows and films using the CA approach. One has to keep in mind, however, that these interactions may differ from natural discourse. Not that you should be discouraged from studying them in this class. Now we're coming to an interesting issue of observer's paradox. You may have heard of it before in your other linguistics classes. Let's go over its basic premise. Knowing that they're being observed changes people's behavior. A person may decide to mind their P's and Q's because they don't want to be perceived in the negative light. Or they may decide to breach some rules of conduct in order to express their independence. And they may not even be aware of the changes in their behavior. But we want to observe how people behave naturally, in other words, how they act and talk when they are not minding their P's and Q's or going for a bit of shock value. Yet we cannot legally and ethically record human interactions without the participants' informed consent. In other words, they need to know they are being observed. Paradoxical, right? What's a researcher to do? This is where it is important to remember that even though we cannot entirely eliminate some of the effects of the observer's paradox, they're not going to affect the naturalness of our data to a very significant degree. First and foremost, the principles and procedures we follow in organizing our talk are subconscious. As regular human beings living our lives, we're not aware of them and are not aware that we're deploying them in interaction, unless they're broken. And one cannot change what one is not aware of. Therefore, because people can't alter what they don't know they're doing, being observed does not fundamentally change how they organize their talk. It is also impossible to predict how exactly observation will affect the behavior, not for the researcher, not for the participants themselves. This is a variable we cannot control, so we consciously and deliberately choose not to control it. We do not even attempt. Researchers of human behavior have been aware of the observer's paradox since the early 1970s. In fact, its precursor, the Hawthorne effect, was noted in the 1920s and 30s by efficiency engineers in industrial settings, although the term Hawthorne effect was not coined until the mid-50s. Hundreds of studies have been conducted since then in psychology, sociology, linguistics, and education with a keen awareness of this paradox. Yet they have demonstrated again and again that the effect of the observer on the interaction is rather minimal. To wrap up this portion of our discussion, we have to keep in mind that our participants need to know that they're being observed and recorded. They must know. Informing them of this is our legal and ethical obligation as researchers. While admitting that we rather observe how people behave naturally, we still accept that their observed behavior is not going to differ from the unobserved behavior in drastic enough ways to affect our data collection, analysis, and results. We must always obtain informed consent from the participants. CA can be conducted either on collections of data, an accumulation of many instances of a particular phenomenon observed in many interactions, or on single cases of interaction. We will address each type of CA analysis in turn. Let's start with data collections. The first thing we need to know about them is that they do not necessarily need to be large. CA does not depend on statistics or numbers. Just because something is not frequent, its infrequency does not make it less important or less ordinary. Case in point, while the most common response to a greeting, "How are you?" is something along the lines of "fine, good, doing okay," occasionally a different response arises, such as "better" or "not as good as I hope to be by now," and so on. If we were to record all the exchanges involving "how are you," millions of them probably, the latter responses, that is, "better" or "not as good as I hope to be," would be in a minority. Yet they're still meaningful and very much context generating. They trigger a further inquiry about the respondent's well-being. To not produce such an inquiry is to create a noticeable and accountable absence in discourse. Because we're not interested in statistical frequencies or significances, we do not need random samples. In fact, such samples would not be possible because data for CA needs to be natural, not elicited. But to investigate a particular phenomenon, we often do accumulate multiple instances of it from multiple data sources. If we want to know how people accomplish invitations, we need to collect multiple instances of naturally occurring invitations. The same would go for veerings off topic and returning to them, stories, contradictions, praises, and so on. Getting a collection of data is not particularly complicated, although it can be time-consuming. Most of the time, the researcher notices something in the data they already collected, or somebody else's data that they have access to, or in an interaction they witness, although that's not the data unless it's been recorded and can be examined further. They decide to investigate the phenomenon. They begin examining the existing data and possibly collecting new data in search of other instances of similar interactions, be they rejections of pickup lines, asking strangers for directions, invitations, or let's say putting forward ideas at a business meeting. Alternatively, a researcher may decide to look at a larger context and investigate how larger interactions are conducted. How are business meetings organized? What is involved in making an appointment at a doctor's office? How do families interact at dinner? Is there a pattern to how first dates go? And so on. The researcher then collects as many such interactions as possible and examines their sequential organization, trying to see if there are any patterns, and if yes, what those patterns are. Analysis of data collections usually lead to generalizations and theories about the orderliness of interaction, turn taking, overlap, management of turn constructional units and particular verbal actions, and so on. But CA researchers often also analyze single cases with the goal of applying the already existing knowledge about turn taking, overlap, management of turn constructional units, and so on to understanding what goes on in a particular interaction. Single case analyses are particularly useful for investigating larger phenomena. For example, identifying communication problems in a business, or finding effective and supportive ways of conveying a serious diagnosis to a patient, or figuring out how people construct their identities in interaction. Having collections of data is not exclusive from the single case analyses. You can have multiple single cases in a data collection. In our course, of course, you're free to start a collection of data on a particular phenomenon. But given its introductory nature and the shortness of the semester, you're probably going to focus on single case analysis or an analysis of a limited number of cases in a small collection. This concludes our overview of how to do conversation analysis, and we're going to practice the principles and steps we discussed today throughout the whole semester.